Good evening, everyone. I just want to thank Alison and John for this invitation. It's very nice to see you again after 15 years. A lot of time has passed and, well, the world has changed quite a lot. This is really a conversation. It's not so much a lecture. And I want to start with my story as part of my side of the conversation. I had a fairly typical white South African childhood. My parents were creative. We had a lot of exposure to nature. And I studied at the University of Cape Town, which was considered radical at the time. They called it Moscow on the Hill. And this was all overshadowed by apartheid. It pushed me into a socially and environmentally responsible architectural approach. After starting a practice in Namibia in 1998, I won a competition for the Habitat Research and Development Center in 2002, and then realized I need to really get to learn something about sustainability. So spurred on by this, I attended a solar academy where I met John, and he stole my line about ISIS. So yeah, you have the logo to prove it. Krista du Plessis, who gave the introductory lecture, really shocked me with her portrayal of what damage construction was doing to the planet. And John gave a very inspiring talk on passive design. This entire experience, it was very intense, a week long of 20-minute lectures at the rate of about 16 a day or 20 a day. It spurred me on to think that I could do better than what I was doing, and that my situation was clear. I had to have a mission and have to practice and promote sustainable architecture. The Habitat Center was our most overtly didactic project. In its design and construction, we displayed ways in which we could research and test alternative materials, technologies, methods, services. Since then, the Habitat Center has had a lot of impact internationally. It's become a bit of a tourist destination. It's been studied by many students in various case studies and books and on site. And it's also become a kind of center for hosting environmental and community-related events. After that, we did the Twyfelfontein Visitor Center, which was a kind of art flow of the materials studies that we did at the Habitat Center. It used really a very limited palette of local materials, 50-gallon drums for the roof, local sandstone in gabions, locally manufactured clay brick, and reed ceilings. So an entirely kind of primitive construction, but working very well in that climate. And since then, we've applied passive principles throughout: orientation, thermal mass, natural ventilation. This building is completely reversible. If ever the needs change, it can be taken down and the materials can be reused elsewhere, or they can just go back into the earth. We've done many small projects since then, rural projects, mainly tourism-related or community-related, using very similar principles. This is the Sorosaurus Tourism Information Center. This one is the Fish River Canyon viewpoint. It's the second largest canyon in the world after the Grand Canyon. And we also did this community center in Ohanye, where we used sandbags for walling. And in our own office, we showcased a lot of these ideas and materials. It helps to be able to say to people that, yes, you should put solar on your roof if you have solar on your roof yourself. It's much easier to convince them. And Namibians kind of like the concrete. They want to see things in real life. So we used that. We also did a lot of pot boilers for government. Far more conventional work, but still adhering to the principles of passive design, local and durable materials, and a frugal approach to architecture. This is a high school that we did in the far north. And from about 2012, after about 15 years in practice, we started getting commissions for bigger projects. This was a library 3 regional libraries. They were funded by the Millennium Challenge, the American fund. And here we started adding, well, on the bigger scale, things like flexible modular approaches, solar ready roofs, the solar PV angle dominated the form giving, and so on. Small things also had a good impact. We used a lot of, you can see in the wood there is a invasive timber called Prosopis glandulosa. It's mesquite from the south of the US, which is taking over grazing land and invading it at a rapid pace in Namibia. A friend of mine started a little carpentry shop where orphans that have grown out of the Hope Orphanage, when they turn 18, they need to get a job. So he started training them, and he's now got a flourishing business using Prosopis as the timber for that. I also co-founded EcoWards Namibia, a green certification program for tourism, and our sustainability experience gave us an entree into the world of conservation, community development, and tourism even more. On the left, you can see the sand-insulated service station at Sossusvlei, and on the right, a lodge called Anderson's Camp, where we also used gabions. And interestingly enough, the tents and all the construction was made from second-hand materials, which we salvaged from a lodge that was being upgraded. The Kalahari Game Lodge on the left was also quite a steep learning curve. We had to replace existing decrepit thatch structures, and instead of replacing them entirely, we just changed the roof finish and redid the interiors. Our most recent project, the Shipwreck Lodge, which is on the right, on the Skeleton Coast, went viral. We had numerous press requests. I think I issued about 50 press kits for it. There was something about the iconography about the of these buildings that really grabbed people's imagination. The fact that we tried all sorts of sustainability techniques and that I could describe them to you didn't really make an impact. What grabbed people, what got them going, was what it looked like and the kind of atmosphere it created. If I look back over the last 20 years or so, I'm surprised at how much work we did manage to do. We never actively marketed. We're not allowed to advertise as architects in Namibia. We have fairly archaic laws. But I'm also no good at cocktail parties and business lunches, so it wouldn't have been effective anyway. But you can see that we did quite a lot of work all over the country. Some projects were really tiny, but it doesn't matter because we try and do work that would be beneficial for the people that need it. And most of our communities need very little in order to get a big jump in terms of their quality of life. Parallel to practice, as I said, I founded or participated in a lot of environmental community groups. And for my sins, I'm often asked to present lectures and teach keynotes like this one. And then in 2018, I received the Global Award for Sustainable Architecture, which is organized by the Cité de l'Architecture in Paris and UNESCO. And it was really lovely. I just turned 50 the previous year. I was just very ready to rest on some very comfortable laurels. And of course, the rude awakening came, as it always does. This Calvin and Hobbes has spoken to me for many years because I often get that experience where I wake up twice in a dream state. What happened is that since independence, the Namibian government has been on a spending spree. Architects have been unwittingly riding a wave of a construction bubble. If you look at the growth in depth and debt in the relation to our GDP, we're now at 50% debt of our GDP. And unlike bigger, more developed countries, we don't have a lot to back up that debt. If you look at this and compare it to Namibia, since 2016, our GDP has dropped, our growth rate has dropped radically, and it's just going further and further down. It is unlikely that it will ever recover. I'm not being pessimistic by saying that. It's just that it's the current realities of global economics and of climate change. The Ministry of Finance had slammed on the brakes, and there's no construction or hardly any construction being done by government, which was the main client of the architectural community. Now, I did a relatively limited government work, but because there's no government work for other architects now, they are now moving in on my territory, as one can say, the kind of work that I've been doing, not for a lot of income, mind you, but now that people are desperate, they see the kind of work that I've been doing also as desirable. The property values have dropped radically. The construction industry has shrunk by 2/3 since 2016. So 2/3 of all the companies have closed down, 2/3 of construction workers have lost their jobs, 2/3 of supply companies have closed doors, etc. And coupled with that, we have a drought. It's the worst drought in 90 years, so since the 1930s. Think about the Dust Bowl, American Dust Bowl. It's that kind of scale. We have these scenes now as well of these vast dust storms that come over the plains, similar to what happened in the Dust Bowl. I think for most people who live in fairly temperate climate zones, climate change is not quite yet a reality. It's not yet a crisis. It doesn't touch you personally. You might have a few more wildfires, the summers might be a bit longer and hotter and so on, but it's not as if you walk out of your door every day and you see it right in front of your very eyes. I have had more than half the trees in my garden die. The groundwater table has dropped so radically that they couldn't survive. Many of them were over 100 years old, and they're never going to grow back. Even if I plant them now, they'll never get that old again because they won't be able to survive in that climate. There are trees that are dying of diseases that they've never had before. The one albizia tree in our area and on my dad's farm, we can actually see them dying out. It's a bit like in the acid rain situation in Germany, where you saw entire forests being wiped out. For us in the global south, it's a complete daily shock. It's a reality that we have to deal with. In Namibia, the vast majority of people rely on the land for their livelihoods. Their staple food is millet. People graze cattle, and that's more or less what people live from. Even though agriculture only contributes 4% to the GDP, mining and fishing are the biggest contributors, and tourism. It employs nearly 80 to 90% of the workforce, apart from the people that are subsistence farmers. And here you can see what's been happening this year. We've had such a dramatic reduction in our food crops that people are starving. It's a daily reality. The government can't keep ahead with food aid. People are now living full-time off drought relief grain. It's not a question of it's seasonal or it's just until the rainy season starts and the crops come into flower again. There are people who have now been for 5 or 6 years on drought relief. And of course what happens is people are flocking to the cities in the hope of survival. But what's happening is that the water is becoming a problem. Windhoek, my hometown, has had a recycling system for water since the 1960s. We're a world pioneer in this. We recycle our sewage into drinking water, but it's no longer enough. Our surface dams are empty, and we're using aquifer water. Now, with the recycling system, they've been replenishing the aquifers over time, but over the last 8 years, we haven't had a surplus in order to replenish the aquifers, so we're now on a kind of a fossil water use. If it doesn't rain heavily this and the next season, we will have no water in the city. So we're looking at maybe closing down in 2 years' time if we don't have a lot of rain. Luckily, this year El Nino is weakening, so it looks like it might be a moderate to normal rainy season. So we're all hanging on to that. But I think if you compare it to, we've been using 90 litres per person per day since 2015. And I can tell you it's actually quite a lot. We can do with less. I shower only once a week. I wash every day in a little bowl of water like that. And where previously bedding was washed once a week, it now gets washed once a month or once every 2 months. So you can see global south countries are the front runners in the climate crisis race. But unlike Kipchoge, you know about this guy, don't you? He just broke the 2-minute mile record. It's not a victory for us. We're the early worms getting the bird, so to speak. And it's an angry bird. In personal and immediate terms, my practice has almost no work. I'm holding on to my reduced staff by the skin of my teeth. And I have to radically adjust my plans for the future, and to do so, I must know what to expect. So I've been going through this process of doing some research. I looked at climate action trackers and predictions. And what's quite interesting for me in this one is the gaps between the Paris Accord, current policies, and the expectations. All the accords that we've had, all the wonderful agreements that politicians have signed and so on have not been followed. So I think one can expect the top of that grey curve. Essentially, climate action is stalling. It's not just because of the politics in the world, but it's also because of kind of paralysis that people have. We've produced as much emissions in the last 30 years as we have in the entire previous human existence. And as Wallace Wells puts it, we've done it knowingly. Since 1990, we've known about climate change. Unless we have immediate radical action by government and corporates on a massive scale, we're heading for the most pessimistic predictions. This breakthrough report was quite interesting. It's a centre based in Melbourne, in Australia. And if you read their reports, what they're doing is they're kind of giving you the actual most likely scenarios. And what they're saying to me is that by 2050, I'll be in my 80s, like my parents are now. You know how one plans for your kind of last years, that you're going to probably live there and you're probably going to do that. I love gardening. I had a fantastic vegetable garden. It's gone now. I won't be able to garden. And in the coming 3 decades, we'll be living through very, very turbulent history for mankind. Forced eco-migration, there's a whole list. Water insecurity for every 3rd person, collapse of subtropical agriculture, that's us, we also in the subtropical belt, reduced global food production, and nation states' internal cohesion will unravel. So most of us will be living in a kind of Somalia. Now, I know the US and Europe will probably be the last, and China will probably be the last states to unravel, but you're going to have to deal with the rest of us who are going to need safe places to go. If people think immigration and refugee issues are troublesome topics now, can you imagine how it's going to escalate every year over the coming years? I thought I'd understood the impacts of climate change, but I can't describe to you what this has been to me, what a shock this has been to me. It's suddenly I felt it here in my solar plexus. It was what am I going to do? I've planned for my retirement. I've got some investments and so on. I've got a property in Windhoek. If the city closes down, that property is going to be useless. Investments What will happen to international economics and so-called investments if the whole system implodes? If my city closes down, without water, without food, where will we go? My mom, my dad, my two sisters, my niece and nephew, we all live there. We'll have to find another place to go. And wealthy people in South Africa and Namibia are buying places in Portugal and Greece, because if you spend a certain amount of money, you can get free EU citizenship. But we're talking about 40, 50 million people in South Africa. We're talking about 2.5 million people in Namibia. Not everybody has those resources. When I realized my vague future plans had evaporated like this, I became seriously depressed. The American Psychological Association calls it eco-anxiety. I'm sure a lot of you are suffering from it. And it formed part of this process of reevaluation of my life and my work. It made it very clear to me that I can't continue in the same way. And it also made me question, what have I contributed so far? And apart from earning a living, what is my responsibility? Yes, many of our projects have improved people's lives to some extent, and influencing people towards sustainability has arguably been a very important impact. But is it enough? It doesn't feel enough to me. Looking at this risk and population growth chart, what's interesting is the most risk is at the bottom. You can see where Africa lies, the red. So what I've been doing has not been enough. You know, I'd like to tell myself that I've done good, that I've tried my best and so on, but it's not enough. The crisis is moving much faster than any of our efforts to date. Essentially, none of us are doing enough. So we don't just need sustainable design, we need resilient and regenerative architecture. And we don't just need it from a few people, we need it from everyone. To do this, we need to educate by design, teach by means of design, and design with an intent to teach. One question that I had about the symposium was whether we can use design as an educational tool. Is design didactic by nature? What does architectural design actually do? In a reductionist nutshell, it organizes space and materials for specific purposes. And that purpose can be very layered, physical function being only one layer. It definitely communicates design. Many would say it's the primary purpose, and in the postmodern era, that was raised to the kind of main meaning of architecture. And this brings me to what our buildings say and express. What do they teach? What do they tell people? Not just other architects, not just students, but the world out there. Buildings communicate three things to me. The one is the primary ideas or concerns or belief of its time, the ideology. The second one is the power structure of the society that it finds itself in. And the third is the context. I don't know if you know this famous image. It's essentially if you had limited viewpoints of an elephant and people described those elephants to the elephant to each other, they wouldn't recognize the elephant from these descriptions. So the context is absolutely key. Ideology, status, and context still form the core of what architecture communicates. Despite never believing in a style, a distinct aesthetic is prevalent in my work, mainly because it can be tracked through these three aspects. Contextually, all the projects relate to the place. They're firmly rooted in Namibia, and also the local conditions of each specific site, the climate, the materials available, the culture, and so on. The ideology displayed is one of sustainability, and the absence of status indicators show how little power the communities have that we build for. There's no glitz in any of these buildings. But my work is decidedly out there on a limb, an exception really that proves the rule. And we have to look at where mainstream architecture fits in terms of what it communicates. Consumerism, the dominant world ideology, no matter what your religion, what your beliefs, our ideology is shopping. And these are very well displayed in our buildings. They reveal a kind of obsession with being original or new, which is really a clever sales tactic to make people buy. The power structure of our society, with wealth increasingly concentrated at the top, can also be clearly seen. Contemporary mainstream architecture tells us a story of the easy life, built on a striving for success, for wealth, for power. It's kind of stuck in a post-war prosperity paradigm, envisioning wealth for all, that everybody will be middle class, will all be able to afford a car and a 3-bedroom house, etc., etc. But architecture lies. It makes unfulfillable promises about the future while actively destroying it. It mostly doesn't recognize context. It ignores global and local contextual limits. And when I'm talking about architecture, I'm including green architecture in this. I distinctly remember Walter telling us 15 years ago, we were sitting around the kitchen table in Alison's house, and he said, you do realize that none of us are really doing green architecture. We're trying, but we're not getting there. If it was really green, it would actually be an improvement to the environment. And what he said is still true. I think the most common human aspiration, the most common reasonable human aspiration, is to just survive life with dignity. We need to work within the constraints of our planetary budget. We have to declare an end to the idea of limitless growth. Our obsession with status evolved due to the survival of attributes which signified the most potential for reproductive success, the survival of the fittest. And in our tiny human brains, this is stuck as having the biggest car, having the most money, being the most powerful. However, mainstream architecture, in its pursuit of these ambitions, is actually damaging our ability to survive. Instead of according status to economic success, we should make architecture that is future-proof. We should make architecture that makes us fit to survive. Yes, the damage that architecture does is a cold, hard scientific fact. And as a result of this damage, architecture is in a kind of moral, or should I say immoral, dilemma. It's not unlike the famous $1 million button dilemma. If you press it, you get $1 million, but some random person in another place in the world dies. Would you press the button? We are pressing this button several times daily through the choices that we make in the work that we do. But instead of one random person dying now, billions will just a little bit later. If we want to educate young people to be designers or architects, do we consider our main obligation as researchers, as educators, as practitioners, to teach design that addresses this future risk? Do we even know what that future risk is? Many people see sustainable, resilient design as the end of the road for architecture. an industry so regulated that design as an aesthetic exercise will disappear. What bothers me is that most people tend to see or tend to forget that architecture is not just an aesthetic exercise, that design is not just an aesthetic exercise. It's a difficult concept for these people to grasp. Green design is becoming trendier though, and this attitude is reducing. But there's still a considerable divide between sustainable architecture and design architecture. I understand it's quite a prevalent issue in schools of architecture in the States. You have the sustainable part, and then you have the design part, whereas they should actually be one part. Through our work, our teaching, and our general action, we as architects set the stage for the emerging generation. As long as architecture is complicit in worsening the damage to the planet, we carry a responsibility to reduce the profession's impact. Educating the profession is thus vital, not just students, but also practicing architects. The architectural fraternity reflects the wider debate. There's a polarization reaching right back to our atavistic roots of protecting our tribe against others. We're now in two worlds, deniers versus believers, and never the twain shall meet. Educating the converted sounds easy. They've already crossed the biggest hurdle, that of accepting the existence of the climate crisis. They're already doing their bit for the planet. But what about the rest of the people out there? Don't we spend far too much time preaching to the converted, playing green games with our fellow believers? Philip Sutton thinks that the climate movement has a critical weakness in the low number of conservatives in it. He says that because we're making it a political issue, people on the right end up not doing what they could do in terms of the climate emergency. And I think he's right. I think we need to somehow reach across the divide, and we need to interact with other people. Being a designer or teacher doesn't mean just communicating through our lectures or our designs. It's a responsibility to convey the most crucial message of today, everywhere, all the time, and by all means. Do you speak to the person in the checkout at the supermarket? Do you speak to the person next to you on the bus or waiting for the Max? Nelly Ben-Ayoun says that we have a responsibility to modify power structures, and to do that, she considers it vital to encourage people to interact and listen to different points of view that aren't in line with their own. When I started writing this, I genuinely thought that this would be my main message. I wanted to learn how to deal with people who don't agree with me about the climate crisis. There are all sorts of material on the web about how you can engage people and what you can do in order to not convince them, but to help them to themselves to change their attitude. But I now realize I have to, in a way, preach from outside the choir to the choir, and I'll tell you why. After acceptance that the climate crisis exists, the first reaction that we have usually is panic. You can ask me. David Wallace Wells talks about the value of panic to pushing people to collective action. He and various other pundits see it as an essential step to galvanize people into action. But David Dropik says something else. He says they assume the audience only needs enough facts to be convinced. But this is called the deficit model of persuasion, and it often fails and it often backfires because it doesn't appeal to people's emotions. He cites one of my favorite sayings, the one Pascal Stott saying, La cœur a ses raisons que la raison ne connaît point. The heart has its reasons which reason cannot know. He says these reasons of the heart, cognitive biases, create an entire library of climate delusion. And we know that in practical terms, human nature doesn't change easily. There are actually far fewer climate deniers than we think. In America, it now runs at about 21%. It's only 1/5 of the population. They shouldn't be the main obstacle towards getting action on climate change. We're now moving from peak denial to Cory Doctorow's peak indifference, the psychological reaction to problems that become too big to ignore. But for most people, too big to do anything about, or at least they feel it's too big to do anything about. It comes back to that $1 million button we press. The psychology of risk perception tells us we don't worry so much about risks that don't feel personally threatening, that threaten us later than sooner, or that carry tangible benefits in the immediate. It's so true, isn't it? How many of you drove in a car to the symposium? Oregon has excellent public transport. How many of you flew? There could have been a Greyhound bus or train. I'm in such a state about this that I've decided this is my last long-haul flight. I will never come to the States again. I will probably never go to Europe again. The short-haul flights, the 2-hour flights that I'll be doing in Southern Africa, I will probably replace with a vehicle trip in the future. Unfortunately, our public transport isn't as good, but an electric vehicle or a hybrid car will use a lot less fossil fuel than a plane will. Do you think the breakthrough scenario that I mentioned earlier is highly likely? How many of you think it's highly likely that by 2050 we'll have civilizational breakdown? I'd say it's about a half of people here. It's a lot to take in, isn't it? Do you believe we can avert it? How many think we can avert it? About the same number. Probably the people who believe it will happen will also believe that we can avert it. We all buy into the concept of insurance, don't we? Does it matter what we believe? I'm the kind of person that always plans for the worst case scenario. If it doesn't happen, great. But if it does, I want to be prepared. Nobody's going to sue you as an architect for a measly $20,000. They're going to sue you for millions. So you don't take out a professional indemnity policy for $20,000. You take it out for the millions. And that's what I believe climate action should be. We don't have to convince people of climate change. We only need to convince them not to gamble against the odds. We need to teach them the ways and the means by which to prepare for the worst case scenario. This isn't focusing on risk, it's emphasizing the need to avoid it. It's essentially the 1990 Bergen Declaration's precautionary principle. It essentially means that we need not know all the facts about the danger before taking precautions against it. A recent article applied psychologist Stanley Cohen's 3 forms of denial to climate change: literal, interpretive, and implicatory denial. It's quite interesting. All of us are at least one of them. The first holds that climate change doesn't exist. The second, that it does, but that it's natural and unavoidable. The last is the most insidious and dangerous. Implicatory denial means that we accept that climate change is happening, that it's man-made, but we don't do enough to combat it. In that sense, we are all climate deniers. Yes, we are damn deniers. Dr. says peak indifference is the point where you divert your energy from convincing people there's a problem to convincing them there's a solution. Collectively, we waste a lot of energy on denigrating or mocking deniers. we also spend a lot of time criticizing other efforts at addressing climate change. Yes, maybe that's the scientific method, but the biblical analogy of the beam in one's own eye comes to mind. I feel we need all hands on deck. We need every large, small, and intermediate action necessary to address the crisis. We need to support every person doing something to avert the crisis. The only valid criticism to me at this stage would be if something exacerbates climate change, or if it's a wasted effort which should rather be redirected elsewhere. So I've come to terms with the fact that maybe geoengineering is going to be in our future. I've come to terms with the fact that maybe nuclear energy is going to have to be used. I don't agree with it, but I'm not going to stand in a picket against geoengineering when I should rather be standing in a picket against fossil fuels. We need to face the future head on, and we need to deal with it assertively. So I didn't go much further in elaborating this conversation. Personally, I've made a few decisions. I've decided to build resilience into every project that I do, and to do it in such a way that I educate the clients, the users, as to the most serious impacts that climate change will have for them. It's not pleasant. I've lost clients that way, but it's necessary. We need to include serious regeneration aspects in every project. And it's quite difficult in a desert climate. It's not that easy if people are using groundwater and so on. Quite often it might be, don't build this project at all, or rather move your project to another place. It's very difficult for an architect to tell his clients, his or her clients, not to do a project. But we might have to. I've had to in some cases, and I expect that I'll probably be doing it more. We have to ramp up cross-disciplinary support. We must not continue in our own little bubbles. And we have to assertively source funding for mitigation and adaptation. I know that academics are quite used to sourcing funding, but practicing architects are really terrible at it. They kind of sit and wait. They bid for projects and they kind of sit and wait for things. But I think as architects, we need to make projects that mitigate and adapt. And we need to get the funding for that. Personally, no more complacency. I'm aiming for a net zero lifestyle. It's going to be quite difficult financially, but I'm definitely going to do it in the next 5 years. As I said, no more long-haul flights. Carbon offset if necessary. Divesting completely from fossil fuels. And this is quite tricky because my unemployment insurance, my life insurance, all of those things are part of bigger pools. You know, you belong to a certain body and then they invest. So I'll have to go and research them and go and talk to each of them individually and get them to divest. And I don't know how successful I'll be, but it's what I have to do. I'm thinking of investing quite considerably in renewables. If I can't find a suitable investment platform to actually build a small-scale solar farm myself and just extend to it as I have cash available. And very importantly is to do person-to-person advocacy, to talk to everybody about it, even if it is unpleasant and even if it can hurt your popularity stakes. As designers, we're creative. Creativity is probably what got us in this humanity, in this terrible pickle in the first place, because we like making things. But maybe it's the only thing that's going to get us out of it. So we need energetic creativity. And this really is the first contribution to my conversation. Where it will develop, I'm not sure, but I'd like people to join in. If you have ideas for what I can do, how I can improve, reduce my carbon footprint, what I can do more to take action, I'd appreciate it. Thank you. not sure if there's space for questions. Alison says yes. So questions or comments, you're welcome to jump down my throat. I'll tell you one little story just as an end of that I thought of. I gave a talk in Cape Town 2 months ago, and the audience was shocked, speechless. And the reason they were is because I said something towards the end. I'd attended a pottery workshop with my mom the previous week, and the lady who was running the workshop said during lunch something about her grandson. The discussion was about aging. Her grandson of 5 looking at her. She was about 60, and he looked at her and he said, "Grandma, when I'm as old as you, you'll be dead." And I couldn't help myself, you know, because I was struggling with all these things. And I said to her, "Well, he'll be dead too, probably." My family is not noted for their tact. I hope you're not shocked speechless as well.
I was shocked speechless, so it just took me like 60 seconds to regain my composure, but thank you very much for this eye-opening, that's a great image to end with, presentation. It's really given probably all of us a lot to think about, especially coming from the perspective of somebody that's living in the global south that doesn't have the opportunity to sort of continue in this denial stream. What I'm sitting here thinking about is, in this room of people that have come from all over the country, all over the world to meet and talk about this issue, and your statement about avoiding long-haul flights, I'm thinking about how we continue global awareness while not continuing global travel, and how do we continue communicating and talking and exchanging, sharing ideas, without the component of transportation, which is such a big part of this. And what are your thoughts on that? How do we stay connected while maybe becoming less physically connected?
I've been talking to people about organizing transatlantic sailing ships. Wouldn't it be wonderful if I could have come here on a ship? And what I should have done is I shouldn't have flown from Amsterdam to Portland. I should have landed in New York and got a train. You know, there are various reasons why I didn't, but all of those reasons are actually not as important as the climate crisis. I was hoping that America would have its high-speed trains by now, but it hasn't yet happened. But I see a perfect business opportunity for transatlantic and crossing the oceans, trans-Pacific sailing. You know, you can now do it. How much? I was told that from Walvis Bay, which is our coast, you can go across the Atlantic in 10 days. That's not bad. It's not weeks. 10 days would have been ample for me to do the talk, because that's about how much time I spent on it at work. So I might as well have done it on a ship. No, of course, there's also online communications. It's not as effective. I think, obviously, if you just saw my face in the slides, it wouldn't have been as effective as if I was standing right here. But, you know.
I have a question. I heard you in 2004 at the ACES conference that was here in Portland. I was sitting next to John Reynolds, and by the end of your talk, we were both in tears. You ended it up by urging America to do the right thing. Mm. What do you think now?
It's very difficult for me to comment. You know, of course, I can get into a whole kind of Trump bashing rant. But what bothers me is that there's a lot of polarization in the States. On the flight to Amsterdam, while we were waiting, we were chatting to a lady, and she was raging against Republicans. And I saw a little TV clip of 2 news anchors. I can't remember what program it was, where the one guy was saying, "I will never sit to dinner next to somebody who voted for Trump. And I just thought, you should actually be sitting next to that person so that you can talk to them about it and actually start communicating properly about the issues. It's as if people don't talk to each other. I think it's really tragic, you know. That's why I spoke about preaching outside the choir. And it doesn't matter whether they voted for Trump. If they can stop driving a diesel or a gas car and they can switch to an electrical vehicle, that's a small victory. You understand what I'm saying? I'm saying that we should look past these kind of political barriers and so on, and we should really get involved with people on a day-to-day basis. They say one of the best ways to engage with people is to try and speak to them and find out what things affect them personally. You know, one of the things that's interesting is that farmers all across America are doing regenerative agriculture, even if they vote conservative, because it's affecting their daily livelihoods. You know, so if one can address that, you know, let the politicians play in their playpens, and let's take civic action for the better. After all, those are the things that always went right in America, is when the community stood up. I don't think much of democracy, honestly. Political democracy, to me, doesn't make any sense, because it's not really democracy. In my country, people vote on tribal level, so we have the same party that we will have. It's called the ruling party. We're a democracy, but they talk about the ruling party, you know. So it doesn't really matter what politics does. I must say I'm disappointed in a lot of things that I have seen. I would have thought, and because when I was in Oregon last time, the light rail was so fantastic and so on, there was a lot more, what must I call it, kind of enthusiasm and drive for what needed to be done. But on Sunday when we arrived, we went up to the zoo, and when we came back with the bus, it stopped at a stop sign, and there was a lady standing outside, and she asked the bus driver, "Is this a new bus?" And he said, "Yes." And she said, what is it, hybrid? And he said, "No, it's diesel." And she said, "Really?" And he said, "Yes, all the new ones are diesel." And I felt that was shocking. Surely Oregon, of all the states, and Portland, of all the cities, should by now have broken away from fossil fuels in their public transport. If any of you have any kind of influence in Portland, there's an issue for you to address.
I left Ames, Iowa this morning at 6 o'clock and drove in the dark up to Minneapolis to the airport. Yes, I used a car, and it's not an electric yet because there are no plugs where I could plug it in on the way between Ames and Minneapolis. But what I did see in the morning in the dark was the horizon is full of red lights from the wind turbines, and they were not there 15 years ago when I moved there. My city is now building a solar farm. Those, I think, are also moments we have to cherish and see that there is progress, even if it's not happening on the top.
I fully agree with you. You know, when I did the Habitat Center when I started in 2002, I couldn't get VOC-free paints. It just didn't exist. We ended up using homemade lime wash. And now every paint is VOC-free that we buy. So there has been a lot of change. I think my point is that we mustn't be complacent about these things. You know, you have these corporate advertisements about how green. ExxonMobil is green because they're exploring carbon capture. Really? So I agree we need to celebrate things, but we need to then say, what can we do more? They've just introduced EVs to Windhoek over the last few months. And the problem is the same, the range. We can only go a limited range. But now what I want to do is I want to actually go and talk to people who run gas stations and say to them, put in a rapid charging station, you know, I'll be the first to use it, and so on. I find in Namibia it really works if you speak face to face with people. It's a small community, but I think that works everywhere. And just because I'm an architect doesn't mean I can't go and, you know, next time on the way to visit my dad, which is 350 k's away, if I can just get 2 charging stations on the way, I can drive an EV there. Yeah.
I have a question, not for you, but for pretty much everyone else in the room. Now and then I teach as a hobby, and for quite a while I've asked students in studio classes what their environmental values are. Climate change is something that I think everyone in this room has been aware of and very concerned about for a long time. It struck me over the years how little movement there's been toward recognition that climate change, unlike many of the other environmental concerns, is a true existential crisis. And we're not getting through.
Mm.
There's something in the fundamental introductory courses that is not getting through to our students, so that by the time they're in mid-level studios, they know that they need to be focused on this. Do we blame that on the somewhat artificial sustainability design divide? Do we blame it on inertia? Do we blame it on idiocy? I don't know. But, you know, I'm looking at Nancy, I'm looking at Aaron, I'm looking at Walter, I'm looking at Allison. These are my friends, these are my tribe. And if we can't even do it here, where can we do it? And I just want everyone through the rest of this symposium to think about that question. It's a question for you.
I have an interesting story that might relate to that. I was in Australia a long time ago, and I had a back injury, so I was lying on my back and watching TV for about 10 days. And they had this wonderful series which was about the settlement of Australia by the whites. And it was very kind of hard-hitting for the first time. They were talking about the serious impact it had on Aborigines. And one of the first things were that when the first 3 ships sailed into the harbour in Tasmania, there were Aborigines in canoes carrying on, you know, and there were people on the beach and so on. But they completely ignored these big ships, you know, and the white sailors got off and they got on the beach, and then when they walked up to people, the people went like, oh my God, and they ran away. And psychologists say that these ships were so large, they were so away out of their experience, it was so something that they couldn't envisage, that they literally didn't see it. And maybe that is part of the problem, that schools, that the kind of architecture is this, you know, it's making things nice, it's making things pretty, it's design, it's living out your creative potential. It's not something that actually deals with the hard realities, the harsh realities of life. Maybe it's to do with all our renderings.
Thank you for your presentation. As far as architectural education is concerned, I'd like to say one thing I've noticed is that there seems to be a divide between people who believe cities are the problem and people who believe cities are part of the solution. I'm thinking about a diagram that a friend of mine sent me. It was actually part of a presentation at the U of O, Mike Dennis, and it was a map of the metropolitan area of Chicago. And it showed vertical vehicle miles traveled and carbon emissions related to it. And in the center of the city, where there were fewer vehicle miles traveled, the emissions obviously were much lower than they were in the suburbs. So the argument here, I think at least in part, and I'd like to get your opinion about this, is compact living environments, walkable environments, where traditional cities were able to provide that in some measure, as opposed to the suburban sprawl, which is also part of the United States scene. How important do you think that is in fighting climate change?
we have cities, they're there, and people will continue moving to cities. I think that's a reality. So we have to make cities as sustainable, as resilient as we can. I agree with you that compact cities are obviously ideal and so on, but I've become very involved in urban issues in Namibia now for precisely that reason, because our kind of thinking is stuck in 60s America. We're still building malls, can you believe it, in the suburbs. So there's a lot of that needs to be done. I don't think it's cities versus suburbs. I think you need sustainable suburbs because there are a lot of suburbs. You're not going to densify the suburbs to the status of cities, but you have suburbs, so you have to deal with making them sustainable. Get cars off the road, do things in the suburbs that people can work there, that they don't need to travel. You know, all of these things, we know them. You know, they're very kind of common sense things. But what I don't like is when people say, you believe this and I believe that, and therefore we can't agree. There are ways in making things sustainable. There are ways in following a green path without denigrating somebody else's green path.
Thinking about the diagram you showed of the economic situation in your country, it brings to my mind the question of where are the resources going to come from to achieve our more sustainable world if we really don't react until it's economically too late.
There's a strong economic argument for being sustainable, for dealing with a crisis. Whatever we don't do now is just going to cost us a lot more later. I think.
But we're not going to have any money later.
So maybe what we should do now is spend as much money we can on mitigating the crisis. You understand what I'm saying?
I guess I'm just
Yeah.
thinking out loud that it doesn't make me optimistic.
Look, there'll be money. There will be wealthy people who have money, and most of the people in the States, you academics, you're on the upper level of income, you'll probably still be well off. I'm in a kind of a difficult situation. I'm probably in the upper 10% of income in Namibia, but I employ people who are really in the bottom 10%. You know, can I justify certain expenditures, certain luxuries and so on that I have, while knowing that they might not even have water? You know, it's that kind of balance. I think if we're serious about it, we have to reduce our standard of living to be more commensurate with what 80% of the world is going through. I'm on a shopping strike. What do you call it? I only buy food. I don't buy anything else. I buy fuel for my car when I need it for trips, but I avoid driving as much as possible. I say to people, let's sort this out by email, let's sort it out by phone. I've now, my cupboard has got clothes in it that's 30, 40 years old. In fact, I still have my dad's coat from when he was at university in the 1950s, and I wear it. I do think we can do a hell of a lot in terms of consolidating, you know, making do with what we have and making do with less, and putting more resources towards climate action. I'm not bragging, by the way. I just find it amusing that I'm still wearing my dad's coat. My mama hates it. She thinks it's too tatty.
Thank you, Nina, for this heartrending kind of talk. I remember when you came to U of O before, you were the first person to talk about design for deconstruction, and it just rang with me so strongly. It's amazing. And I really appreciate, although you describe such a dire situation in Namibia, you also describe how personal choice is the only thing we have left, and we must have every person do as much as they can. So that is really incredible. And even just getting people not to eat hamburgers is going to be a step. And we need all those tiny little steps, and they do add up. I am curious, you told us this terrible story of what's happening in your hometown, and I'm wondering, how are coalitions, what is the most effective solution that you have seen? Because there are other cities around the planet that are also running out of water, and I'm sure you've looked at how they're dealing with it. And I'm curious about, what are the most successful things you've seen for addressing these very difficult resource shortages of water?
One of the important things is that there's this kind of obsession with centralization and control. And for many years, our municipality, you weren't actually allowed to have a rainwater tank because they felt mosquitoes would breed, it was a health hazard, people's water would be clean, they'll get sick. It's this kind of state control. But luckily, they've changed their minds with that. The other thing is that efficiency is a big issue. With us, it's not just the water supply to homes, the leaks and things that loses water, but it's also now the whole sewage return system to the purification plant. So I'm very much in favor of grey water recycling on site, because then you don't have these losses. It's just like electricity, the longer you take things, the more losses. But that's another thing, you have to have it certified, so the grey water systems that are available are very, very expensive. I'm now getting involved in a project where we'll be doing kind of innovation training for informal settlements to show people how they can do their own grey water recycling and so on. One of the things that I think is a crime is that we're still using flush toilets. It's so ridiculous to flush your drinking water down the toilet. But now, because of the system we have, and it's all one system, they actually need enough water to go in to, it's a whole drama. But if we stopped flushing toilets, if we had, we would have radically more water if we used dry toilets. And I think that's actually a worldwide issue. Yeah. We have formed a group called Save Water Namibia, a Facebook group that's been very active. We only have 2.5 million people, so we're already running at about 6,000 members, which is a lot for Namibia. And that has also raised quite a lot of awareness. There's a lot more kind of public advocacy. One of our members, for instance, has now been asked to participate in various councils and things. We haven't solved the problem yet. One of the ideas is to bring water from the Kavango, which is the river that feeds the delta in Botswana, but that's not going to work. It's the ecological implications are terrible. I think we probably have to face maybe moving the city to the coast, and having desalination. It sounds radical, but yeah.
I share a little bit of your cynicism about the effectiveness of certain forms of government, but I am curious, can we actually have a durable climate movement verging on kind of austerity without a really radical commitment to democratic practices?
I'm not sure. I'm not a politician. I'm not an economist. But I've been to China, and it was a complete culture shock. It's a very alternative universe there. But I don't condone their human rights practices at all. But I could entirely see why they have such a dictatorial system, because it's just so vast. The scale of what we're talking about is just so vast. So one would have to watch and see what they're going to do. They are applying a lot of climate action procedures. Whether it's enough and whether it's really going to solve the problem, I don't know.
Hi, thanks for your talk. I found it touching and really thought-provoking. I'm wondering if you could weigh in on two questions. So first of all, I think everyone believes and knows that collective action is required to achieve some change, and the changes that we need in the face of the climate crisis. And I'm struck by your own personal commitment to individual change and sort of an individual austerity, not coming here or not coming on long-haul flights again, and making some pretty radical changes to your own spending decisions and consumption decisions. But I'm also struck by, and I think we touched on this a little bit in some of the questions and comments so far, but you're saying we need to reduce our standard of living, but if you look at the accumulation of capital by the very, very wealthy, individuals, corporations, global corporations, is it not that we might need to think differently about how what we have in terms of our economic and material and energy and water resources are distributed? It just strikes me that's really the core problem here, because you're talking about your own position, class position, and the people that you employ maybe not being able to afford water, and that's I'm not by any means thinking that is not actually a problem. But when you look at that at the global scale, right, of how much we have here in this country, and then even within our country, how much the very, very wealthy have versus the rest of us, university professors included, it just seems like that's a layer here that maybe requires a different kind of collective action than what you're calling for, and I'm just curious what you think about that.
It's quite a dilemma when you talk about the upper, how many percent is it now, 3% or whatever. I have a project which is for a very marginalized community in Namibia, and it's to build 5 schools. The schools are only 2 classrooms, 2 dormitories, etc. And we have possible funding by an organization in London. And what's quite interesting is that the person in charge of this funding process is the daughter of the chairman. I'm not going to mention names. I'm going to get really in trouble. And she's also heading a major international environmental organization. But in dealing with her and the issues about bringing the budget down and so on, they insist on us using a certain building method, and they flew me to the factory in Spain to go and have a look. And I had to stay, and they booked for me in this really luxurious hotel. And I just looked at all of this and I thought, what a waste. The cost of my flight, the cost of, the accommodation, all of that would have gone some way towards, not build a whole school, but it would have at least paid for quite a bit of it. And I just realized that the ultra wealthy live in this kind of like rarefied atmosphere where they just think these things are natural, The past week in Portland, I stayed in a little hotel where the bathroom was down the corridor. It's like a old-fashioned lodging house. And it was perfectly fine, But to somebody like that, the idea of not having an ensuite bathroom is kind of like, it's inconceivable, And for a lot of people, not having a flushing toilet is inconceivable. So I think it doesn't really matter what level you're talking about. If you can start with having one person on that level starting to reduce their lifestyle or going to self-imposed austerity of some kind, then maybe that person's impact will run along that level. Mine hopefully will run along my level. I can talk to her whenever I meet her face to face, because it's quite difficult. And I can say to her, are you aware that you live in this kind of thing, that even though you running this environmental organization, your personal footprint is ginormous. What are you going to do about it? I can engage with her in that way. On a political level, I think, you know, if I was living in America, I would engage in major political campaigning. But I wouldn't go to rallies for Democrats. I would rather look at kind of door-to-door, other ways of reaching people to get them to vote. I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is an amazing person from what I can see. I know a lot of people don't agree with her, but obviously the Green New Deal is really the only way that one must go forward. I've just been reading a book by a guy who was the Australian Commissioner for the Environment. And he got fired 3 days after the Conservative government came in Australia. So they went crowdfunding and they started up the commission again, but now it was a private thing. So I think there's a lot of things that can be done both within politics and outside politics. And I think what's important is that every person must do their utmost with what they can do. One of the reasons I'm so strong on this individual things is that I'm not really a group person. I'm not very good in a group social context. So I can do things by example, and I kind of exhort people. It's more like a missionary attitude rather than a kind of like buddy pat on the back system. But I think every one of us has certain talents that we can use.